Hi, I'm Elizabeth Wein. I'm the author of Codename Verity, and I have a new book coming out in May set in the Codename Verity universe, and it is called The Enigma Game. This is the cover of the US version, which is published by Little Brown, and this is the cover of the UK version, which is published by Bloomsbury. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book itself, just so that the bit that I read makes sense, and then I'll start. Britain 1940, when her mother is killed in the Blitz, Louisa Adair feels she has lost everything. The country she has called home since her family left Jamaica is not a friendly place for an orphan girl with brown skin. She finds work looking after an old German woman who's been released from a detention camp and is living in a pub near an airfield in Scotland. There she meets Ellen, a driver for the Royal Air Force, or the RAF, and Jamie, a pilot, two other young people just as exhausted by the war and just as desperate to fight back. So the section that you're going to hear is after the action has already gotten started. We've met Jamie, we've met Louisa, we've met Ellen, and we've met Jane. And Jane is the old German woman, and they are just getting settled in the pub in Scotland where they've just arrived. She came in slowly, tall and graceful as a goddess in her khaki ATS trousers and tunic. Her hair was still coiled in the neat bun below her peaked cap, but I could see it gleaming like a copper whiskey still as she turned to hold open the inner door for her guest. He walked in past her, and Ellen closed the door. She'd brought home a young man. I wondered for a moment if she did it often, and what old Nancy Campbell had to say about that. Then I saw that Ellen's face was as pale as a dead fish's belly. She hugged her ribs as if her body would fly into pieces if she let go, and suddenly I no longer envied her. She was very, very scared. The man who came in with her seemed perfectly ordinary. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a scarf and sweater like a seaman. He carried a wooden case under one arm, with the other hand hidden deep in the pocket of his heavy coat. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Campbell," Ellen choked out. "He needs a room." "A room," the man repeated, striding to the bar. He was strongly built and much taller than me. He gazed up curiously at the coins in the oak beam over the bar for a few seconds, but he didn't touch them. "A room," he repeated, and he hesitated. "Drink." He put his wooden case on the brass counter and mimed drinking, with his cupped hand going to his mouth. He didn't speak much English. I held my breath, guessing what that must mean. "He's flown from Norway," Ellen whispered. "Norwegian?" asked Mrs. Campbell, frowning. She seemed to distrust all foreigners. But Norwegians probably ought to be made welcome. They would be refugees, escaping the iron rule of the Nazis in their invaded country. "He's not Norwegian," Ellen whispered. "I think he's German." She raised her voice and asked me, "You remember the plane we saw this afternoon? You said—" She trailed off. "It was a German plane?" I asked. Ellen nodded. I stared at the stranger in alarm. If this was a German pilot, this wasn't someone who'd chosen to live in England for decades, like Jane. This was a military man fighting for Hitler, like the German soldiers who killed my parents. This was the enemy, the real enemy, right here in the room with me. My heart lurched in fear. When that passed, it lurched again in fascination. He was also a pilot. A real pilot. The enemy pilot swept his curious glance around the room. He paused to look at Jane. Then he looked at me, standing beside her. My cheeks began burning again. What did Nazis think of West Indians? Not much, I imagined. They wanted everybody to be just like them. They didn't like Jews or gypsies or jazz. The stranger patted the brass bar and pointed to the glasses. Jane spoke up. "Come now, the young man would like a drink," she said from her seat by the now dead fire. "Perhaps he's come to Scotland for the whiskey. Ellen let out a nervous squeak of a laugh. "He'd be better off in America then, where there's no rationing," said Mrs. Campbell, putting on a defiant brave face, like a Londoner in the Blitz. The German pilot pulled his left hand from his pocket, and the hand was closed around a sleek and sturdy black pistol. He'd been holding it all the time, a nasty secret. I didn't dare to move. Jane and Mrs. Campbell froze too. But Ellen's expression didn't change. She'd known all along. She drove him here from the aerodrome, knowing that if she didn't do as he told her, he'd shoot her. The pilot beckoned Ellen, using the pistol. She crossed the room like a whipped dog. He pointed to the beer with the gun. "I don't ken how to draw the ale," Ellen whimpered. "Mrs. Campbell, please get him a drink." Nancy Campbell shook herself to life and quietly let herself in behind the bar. She'd already covered the taps for the night, but she lifted the towel, screwed a nozzle back on, and picked up a clean glass. As she filled it, she made a fierce offer through clenched teeth. "Would you like a sandwich?" The German pilot didn't understand. He rested both elbows on the counter, making his hold on the gun seem terrifyingly casual. "What does he want?" Mrs. Campbell hissed. "I don't mean the room. He can have the room. Ellen, what else does he want?" Ellen shook her head. A wisp of fiery hair escaped her bun, like a flame flicking her cheek. She hissed back, "How do I know? His English isn't very good, and I don't speak Jerry myself." Mrs. Campbell said helplessly, "Aunt Jane?" The old woman stared at her niece with blank, pale blue eyes. She said stiffly, "I don't speak Norwegian." "You know he's not Norwegian," Mrs. Campbell said through still gritted teeth. She handed the full glass to the grim young man. He took it, held it up in a salute, and drank half the pint in one gulp. "Please, Aunt Jane," begged Mrs. Campbell. "What do you want to know?" "Ask him if he'd like a sandwich." Ellen exploded in fizzing, nervous laughter. The man drank off the rest of the pint. Ellen backed up and collapsed into my empty chair at the table across from Jane. She told us, "He's waiting for a talk from intelligence to meet him here. If his contact doesn't turn up, he has to fly off at the crack of dawn tomorrow, and we're to let him. He's a spy or a double agent or some such. He has a code name, they said, Odysseus." I read a lot. I read all the time, and I knew who that was. I thought of the Trojan horse. So did Jane. "Odysseus, man of many wiles," she said, "from Homer's Odyssey." He must have known we were talking about him, because Odysseus sounds much the same in English and German, and I expect Norwegian too. He pointed his gun at Ellen again. "You bloody Nazi bastard," she spat, her voice catching in a sob. "What can I do? You're the one with the gun." He glared at her and handed his glass back to the landlady. While Mrs. Campbell refilled his glass with beer and resentment, the German pilot crossed the room to the piano. He took his wooden case with him. The polished blonde box looked like a small gramophone, much like Jane's, but without the loudspeaker. The pilot placed his box on the piano next to Jane's gramophone and laid his gun on top of the box. The two cases looked like a mother and child gramophone sitting side by side. With his hands free, the German opened the piano lid. His left hand pulled out a hesitant arpeggio of low tones from the keyboard. Almost as if he were surprised to find the piano in tune, he coaxed out a few more handfuls of sound, repetitive and dark and insistent. Then he added a high, sustained trill in the right hand. It was Mendelssohn, the Hebrides Overture. His fingers moved like wind over the keys, and the music was heartbreaking, heart-stopping, filling the damp walls of the old house with beauty and longing and a crashing of waves. It was not a piece I usually think of when I think of Mummy. It is an orchestral piece, but the last time I heard it, Mummy was playing it on the school piano. I don't remember crossing the room. I stood next to him at the piano, tears streaming down my face, and watched his hands, long, bony, strong fingers, and a plain gold ring with a bear engraved on it, flying over the keys. The German pilot suddenly realized I was there beside him. He broke off playing to snatch up his pistol so I couldn't pick it up myself. The music stopped abruptly, and as he grabbed at the gun, he knocked it against his wooden case. The front of the box was a narrow hinged flap held in place by a hasp on the flat lid, and when the gun hit the catch, it must have been loose, the front flap fell open to lay bare a panel full of holes and wires, each labeled with numbers and letters of the alphabet, like a telephone switchboard. The inside of the wooden flap was stamped with a brand name, Enigma. The German pilot flipped the front flap back up. He had to raise the lid on top of the case a little bit to fit the catch back into place, and beneath the lid I saw a keyboard of ordinary typewriter keys. It looked like a portable electrical typewriter. He used the gun to make me step back. Jane spoke suddenly, sharp and scolding in a language I didn't understand. But the pilot did. He put the gun back into his coat pocket and stepped away from me, holding up his empty hands to show he wasn't going to threaten me anymore. I do speak a little German, Jane admitted grudgingly. I know you do, said Mrs. Campbell. The Enigma Game is out in May of 2020. Thanks for listening.